5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
It's how I roll, a shooting star in a film noir. I'm floating around 10 feet on the ground. I'm floating around 10 feet on the ground.
Hello. Welcome back. This is the redo show, episode 31. I don't know. I just had a complete system crash. I had to reboot my computer, reboot my Wi-Fi, everything. But I'm back. Of course, I have no viewers, but that's okay. I will record this show and then it can be listened to at a later time. For those of you familiar with my show, I'm going to tell a story, discuss the science behind it, kind of go from there. We put questions, no viewers to say this to, but we put questions in caps in the chat or comments, and conversation lower caps. Please like, subscribe, spread the word about the technically challenged psychologist who regularly has a breakdown in his show. And we always have fun, that's for sure. Still tweaking some stuff here. Today's show is on tree knocks. We're going to talk a little bit about what they may or may not be. We're going to talk about hopefully for most of the show, we're going to talk about how to develop an experiment. You've heard me preaching the virtues of the scientific method, how to make Bigfoot phenomena of scientific value, and talking about the need for statistics to answer our questions rather than opinions answering our questions. And in this show, we're going to get down to some hypothetical numbers. I'm going to spend the bulk of the show now, especially since we've lost a half hour of time, hopefully speaking to an experimental design on how you can make tree knocks and do a tree knock experiment to differentiate them from human tree knocks. In a best case scenario, it's still going to be unknown species knocks. That's a whole nother subject, how we're going to get from unknown species to Bigfoot species. That's a whole show in itself. But if we get enough experiments going targeting Bigfoot phenomena, eventually the word unknown species is going to just have to fall by the wayside, because so many results, experimental results, should be pointing to Bigfoot. And if they don't, that's pretty important information as well. So, hey, SAP 60, nice to see you. Caught a little bit of your show the other night with the author and traveler, interesting fellow. Nice to see you here. So the story for today revolves around me hearing my first tree knock. When I started doing expeditions, probably about 8-9 years now ago. And on my very first expedition, I heard a Bigfoot roar. We were looking out over a valley in North Georgia, heard a dog bark, immediately some coyotes kicked up, and then a whole pack of coyotes cut loose and started howling for if I don't make it, what I'm going to have to do is just record a third attempt and then publish that and push that out. But keep your fingers crossed. Maybe we'll get through this. So that night, heard my first Bigfoot howl. The next night, when we broke into smaller groups and decided who was going to go where, we didn't have anybody on the other side of the valley, other side of the river, where we heard those coyotes and a Bigfoot cut loose. So that night they sent a group of 4 over there, and it's a story, if you a regular attender, you've heard me tell. I'm not going to get into details, but these guys got to where they figured the coyotes were, and basically they were having little pebbles and pine cones thrown at them, and despite knowing better, they threw back, and it became a big mess. They got zapped with ultrasound, and they got chased out of there, to make a long story short. And they came back into camp. In my first go round here, I mentioned that John Eves, I hope he rests in peace, was the behind the scenes Bigfoot guide for the first episode of Finding Bigfoot, first season. And Glenn Williams, who was also in that group, was a first season 25th episode behind the scenes guide. So these guys were nothing new to Bigfoot phenomena. And when they came into camp that night, they were white as ghosts. They were scared, and justifiably so. So when you hear that story in detail, you can't help but get revved up, because they were surrounded, and there were lots of Bigfoot present based on Bigfoot behavior, at least. So 3 weeks after that, last night out that they had their group before, we decided we'd do a little private outing and get into that general location, and cook a meal, hike back down to where all this happened. John, show us that site and see if we can get in there and see if anything happened. So we cooked a meal. Turns out it was about a 3-mile hike from where we set up camp. Got down to the trailhead where they began to to have difficulties 3 weeks earlier. And John and one other guy who John wanted to take in first, they went down this path, probably didn't make it 100 yards, and they heard him. And the guy that John was with said, okay, I've heard enough, and insisted on coming right back out. So they were, 5 minutes down the path, 5 minutes out. They came out 5 minutes. They didn't. They concluded that it was probably a bear, based on the sounds that they were experiencing. And the guy John was taking down wasn't willing to risk encountering a bear. So I volunteered to encounter a bear, and we walked to the point where they got scared off and kept walking down this path. And if you've ever been in a likely Bigfoot area, I don't know about the rest of you guys who have been on expeditions, one of the things that I notice is generally you're walking a path with a lot of lumber going across the main path. This path had, massive tree after massive tree after massive tree after massive tree after massive tree pushed down across this path. So that as you're walking down the path, on your right was a ridge, and on your left was a deep valley, or the back of a holler, as they might say. And you had to, down on your knees and down on your belly to get over and under some of these trees that had blocked the path because of having fallen across the path, or some people might argue pushed across the path. But even if this is hypothetical, of course, but even if I didn't know I was going down this path, looking for a Bigfoot, looking for any kind of creature, this path was a deterrent wherever you were going. And the size of the trees and what you had to go through to get down, 200-300 yards of this path, it was almost like the path itself screamed out, stay out, just very tough going. So we stopped to take a break, and John asked me if he wanted me to take him to, wanted him to take me to their doorstep. We're playing in their front yard. You want to go up to their doorstep? Sure, why not? So we went up just a little bit up that ridge. Nothing seemed all that different to me, actually, in hindsight, except that he was calling it a doorstep, and it was above the path that we had previously been walking. We hung out there quiet, nothing. John picked up a stick from the ground. He was selective in which one he picked up, kind of softly tapped it against a tree to see if it was going to produce the tone he wanted, and did a single tree knock, what you would traditionally think of as a tree knock, hitting a stick against the tree. He did that once, and within 5 seconds after his sound dying off, we heard, again, to describe it, other people have described it in this same way, the home run, hitting a home run in baseball out of the park kind of whack, like somebody just swung a bat and hit just as solid of a out of the stadium home run as you can. And I describe the sound as very crystalline. Interestingly enough, because we went up the ridge a little bit higher, this sound emanated down in the holler up towards us, which was kind of freaky in and of itself. I was freaked out. I never thought he'd get a knock back. And we were still within yelling distance to the folks waiting down at the trailhead. And they said, did you do that? No, I did the first one, not the second one. So they had some of their own homemade knockers of this kind of ilk. Small baseball bats, full-size baseball bats, kind of paddle-like knockers. Quite an industry has developed, obviously, around promoting tree knockers. And I included the wooden blocks because in a lot of ways, we don't know the effectiveness of any of these tree knockers. And some wooden blocks clacked together might be just as good. And that in and of itself, guys, is an experiment in and of itself. Craig could take that tree knocker. I don't know. I'm losing track of what I said and didn't say. I mentioned that Craig put together 2 2x4s with a hinge so that you could clap them together. Do a controlled experiment. Go out to wherever you think there'd likely be Bigfoot. Make one knock with your tree knocker. Wait 15 minutes. Make another knock with a stick that you pick up from the ground against a tree. Wait 15 minutes. Go on to your next stop, but this time start with the implement you used second at the first place, which I believe was the wood and the stick. So you start with the wood and the stick, pick up a stick, hit against a tree, wait 15 minutes, record, or whether you get anything back or not, of course. And then use the tree knocker you made. Wait 15 minutes again, all the time recording whether you get a response back. Wouldn't hurt to record how long after your provocation you got the response back, and whether it was in response to a native tree knocker picking up a stick, hitting a tree, or a man-made tree knocker. That's an experiment of yourself. You collect that data. You can see what gets the more responses, whether it's the native materials or the handmade pseudo knockers, if you will, if they're even using trees. So you could tell, and it was interesting because, of course, everybody got excited when they heard that knock come back to John's. So one person tried his tree knock, no response. Another person tried their tree knock. You could tell the difference in the tone between these two homemade tree knocking devices that these folks brought with them, and none of them provoked another response from another tree knock. And so finally, John tried his stick in the same tree again, and he didn't get any additional knock, just one home run hit out of the park, crisp and clean as you can imagine it would sound, was what we got back. So that was pretty exciting. We walked back to the trailhead and hiked on back home. But that was the very first tree knock I heard, and I wish I wish you could get in my head and hear the sound, that crystalline, crisp kind of sound, because that's one thing that other people who have experienced tree knocks usually talk about and focus on. Nice encounter. Not a class A, but it's something. I do think that we've got to do something to somehow systematize and standardize our knocking devices. we need to look at, is there a particular tonal quality or vibratory quality in the sound waves that it produces that they're more likely to respond to in others. So I'm not going to belabor that point in my presentation today, but basically we're using a tree knocking device as a test. And I don't know how much you guys know about testing, but you want to know that you're testing what you think you're testing and that you can reliably test that. And how do you do that? You do that through repetition. And so you could literally make a tree knocker, if in fact there's a specific tone, you could determine that through experimentation, refine that, and literally standardize a tree knocking device that has been scientifically shown to produce more responses, if, of course, there is a relationship there. And that's part of what we're going to talk about in a little bit. But a lot of people, myself included, with this show, and I guess with my book, we're all pimping Bigfoot. I think this is one of the big developments. The tree knocker devices are endless. Kind of neat, kind of cool to customize yours and make them. But do we really understand which they're responding to, when they're responding to it, and why they were responding to it? Do we really understand what it is or how it is they're responding? And that gets into what are your beliefs about tree knocks? When I was first introduced to the concept, all anyone talked about was picking up a stick, knocking it against a tree, or picking up a bigger stick, tree-like stick, and knocking it against a bigger tree and getting that wood knock sound. And for a long time, I think it was pretty accepted that that's what they're doing. Hey, AS, you didn't put it in caps, but I'm going to put you up. I hope you don't mind. ASAP 60, who's got a great mind. Do you think those trees are down to gather wildlife or maybe make it easier to trap food? That's an interesting question. I was attributing their um, their presence there as kind of like a keep out sign or to deter people from going further down the path. But that could be the reason that they're down like that, to make it easier. It could have a little bit of both. Uh, uh, you know, I think that's a good hypothesis, and I think that underscores, we're two reasonably minded people, and we have two different interpretations of why those trees were pushed down across that path. And to me, again, that just underscores why we need to bring science and experimentation to this field to tease out those kinds of questions. Awesome question. Thank you. So yeah, I think it's a possibility. I don't think we know much. So, first few years, tree knock. It was a tree knocking a stick on a tree. I think Janice Carter may be the only one to have visually seen a Bigfoot knock against the tree with a stick. Otherwise, we've been attributing those knocking sounds to the mechanics of hitting a stick against a tree for quite some time. I'm not sure. I wish I knew who to attribute these different theories, or more accurately, hypotheses to. But some people said, oh, it's just a hand clap. They're not hitting any tree. It's just a hand clap. And then some people said, yeah, it's a hand clap, but they do it right in front of their mouth with their mouth wide open to act like a resonating chamber, if you will. And they cup their hands to act as a megaphone, if you will. So, making that sound. Doing that with a tongue click. Doing that with teeth clacks. Amplify and sending it out. And then, again, I learned about it through reading Dr. Meldrum's book, um, Sasquatch Legend Meets Science 2, where he discussed the possibility that they could be like, apparently great apes still have a vestige bellow, but apparently earlier on in their evolution, they had like a bellows somewhere in their body, maybe around their lungs or the side of their body. I can't localize it for you. And they could force air out of those bellows and out of their mouth. And as evolution went on, the major portions of the bellows, I guess, receded. But apparently, gorillas, I believe, still have vestige bellows in their bodies. And so the thought that could be what's making the sound. And, we could, well, certainly on a Bigfoot page on Facebook or any other social media platform, we could probably argue and debate for hours about what is, which of these are producing that tree knock sound. And if, as we're just briefly discussing this, if you've heard any other stories, I listed the ones I'm familiar with. If you know of any other mechanisms that you've heard about how Bigfoot makes that tree knock sound, please put them up, or put them up in the chat, share it with the group. But the ones I'm familiar with is literally doing a tree knock with a stick in a tree, the hand clap in front of the open mouth, with the mouth acting as a deflector, megaphone, cupping your hands for vocalization, doing that for teeth clacks, tongue clicks, and then we got the vestige bellows theories. One, I don't think I have to point out to anybody that these have evolved from a theoretical perspective of anthropology, evolution, things of that nature. There, as you all know, there are other theories about what Bigfoot is and how they came to originate that may or may not try and dispute this. But, you're going to expect an anthropologist, a zoologist. You're going to expect those kinds of people with those kinds of educational backgrounds to support an evolutionary, previously unnoticed species, relic species. They're going to fall in the flesh and blood kind of category. I don't think they necessarily have to preclude a spiritual being or a metaphysical being, but I think most, the theoretical bent, and I think the spirit of these discussions and these hypotheses, which we really haven't tested, and that's why I'm not calling them theories. That's why I'm calling them hypotheses. Because they haven't been tested. But I think the spirit of such hypothesis is probably more of a flesh and blood and evolutionary spirit. Anyone else have heard any other theories about how they make the tree knock sound? It's pretty amazing when you hear one. It's pretty amazing how wood-like it sounds. If they're not knocking a stick, a big heavy stick up against a tree and making that tree knock sound, any other explanation to me after having heard one, to me just is amazing, and I would really want to understand how they're able to make that home run baseball hit out of the park sound with their teeth, with a vocalization tongue click, with a vestige bellow. Boy, I would love to better understand the mechanics of that. Now here's the bumper for our vocabulary lessons for today, so we can discuss doing an experiment. I'm going to remind you guys of the difference between a sample and a population. Population representing all of everything all over the world that you're trying to measure, and a sample being a small proportion of that rather than everything all over the world. So last show this came up, I used shoe sizes. If we're going to measure the population of shoe sizes, we would literally have to measure every shoe size of every person in the world. Pretty time consuming, labor intensive. But we could take a sample from the United States, sample from Latin American countries, African countries, European countries, Russian countries. And so without having to measure every foot, we take small representative portions of that particular company or country's shoe sizes, and we've got a sample of shoe sizes all over the world. I like to drink. I like to think about having to test the population of all the malt scotches in the United States, go all over the world testing malt scotches. But again, you don't do that. You buy this brand, you buy that brand, you're sampling from different malt scotches throughout the world and doing your own little experiments based on your own flavor. So a sample is a small representative amount of whatever it is you're trying to measure or whatever it is you're going to do. I hope that's clear. Any questions about sample? Independent versus dependent variables. Now we're talking experimentation, rat running. The dependent variable is the thing that you're going to do something to. The independent variable is the variable that you're going to use to do it to it. So the behavior or the results of the dependent variable depends on the influence of the independent variable. So let's talk Squatch. One of my other shows, I mentioned this, and I really want to reiterate it. So many of us are out there trying to prove Sasquatch by capturing a visual image of Sasquatch. There are a lot of them out there. A lot of people have Class A sightings. Some of them manage to take a picture, some of them don't. Okay? But to do experimentation, you need lots of samples. So if you're going to target the actual biological or spiritual or interdimensional beast Sasquatch, it's going to take you a long time to amass those experiences. And things like interdimensional travel could be so random that it may literally be impossible to use as a dependent variable. So rather than using the physical beast as the dependent variable, we need to start using the phenomena or the spore or the sign that the Sasquatch leaves. You know, one or two Sasquatch may come into an area and create multiple prints, multiple twists. You know, we really don't know. Okay. So rather than focusing on trying to capture the corpuscular beast, no matter what its origins, we need to start using the phenomena that we've become very familiar with as both a dependent and an independent variable. It reflects Bigfoot behavior. And again, this is where psychology comes in. Psychology can quantify behaviors. And so the behavior of the Sasquatch is what we're measuring when we're doing these experiments. That's the dependent variable. The independent variable is what are we trying to provoke? What are we using to provoke a response and influence that phenomena? That's the independent variable. And the independent variable for a tree knock study is a tree knock. Making a tree knock will be the independent variable in this study, because we're trying to see if we get a tree knock back from Bigfoot, supposedly, well, from an unknown species. That's the dependent variable. A returned response from Bigfoot. Independent variable, physically making a tree knock. Okay. Independent, dependent variable. They're important in your experiment. Experimental variables versus control variables versus confounding variables. We've already discussed the primary experimental values in our hypothetical study here. The experimental variables are making the sound of a tree knock, doing a tree knock by the researcher, and whether we get a response to that tree knock or not. Control variables. Well, what other things could produce a tree knock sound that we've got a control for? Or that's more confounding variables. Let's really get to the heart of control variables. What other variables could influence whether a Bigfoot responds with a tree knock, aside from whether they hear it or not? So you'll want to be taking, you're going to want to be recording times of day, seasons of year, barometric pressure, wind direction, air temperature, rain, cloudy skies, bluebird clear skies. The environment might have something to do with whether a Bigfoot responds. I don't know, but that doesn't seem like an unreasonable thing to try and control for. I don't know about you, but I feel a lot less like going out and taking out the garbage in a rainstorm than on a clear day. The weather affects our behavior. Why wouldn't it affect some of Bigfoot's behaviors? So you want to monitor and make note of all these control variables, because when we're done with the experiment, we're going to use these as independent variables to make sure they're not influencing and we're not misinterpreting Bigfoot or an unknown species or humans that making those sounds. So, as you develop your little record sheet, each outing, you'll want to make note of those control variables, confounding variables. Confounding variables would be what else could make a sound like a tree knock? What other animals in nature make that sound? I'll tell you one, beaver tail on the water sounds, unless you're listening closely, can sound very much like a tree knock. Any number, what else comes to mind besides beavers slapping the water? People chopping wood. The good news is about people chopping wood is it's going to be repetitious and rhythmic. And not to say that Bigfoot tree knocks can't be, but you want to control your experiment and see if you can steer clear of areas where people are actively chopping wood. So, because it could be a confounding variable. Deer's rutting, if you're looking at vocalizations, deer's rutting. Got to rule those out before you attribute it to Bigfoot, but we're talking tree knocks, so let's not run afield here. And you understand the difference between a sample and a population, independent, dependent variables, experimental variables. What are we trying to figure out? What are the variables, independent and dependent? Control variables. What other things could influence whether a Bigfoot does a tree knock in response? And then confounding variables. What could mimic the sound of a tree knock or give us a false positive, make us think we're hearing a tree knock when we're not? This next one, random error versus systematic error, this is one of the big things and big advantages of using virtually any kind of science besides observational science, is experimentation allows you to control for random error. For example, by monitoring all those control variables and making sure they're not influencing your results. Or systematic error, experimenter bias, subject bias. You can use your statistical analyses to measure whether those types of bias are influencing your test results, and you can set up your experiment to prevent those kind of biases from coming into play. If you have any questions about any of those terms, don't hesitate to post it. Now we're going to get into, there are a few types of experimental designs that we can use, the type of experiments we're going to run, the processes we're going to use. The two most popular are an A-B design or an ABA design. We'll start with an ABA design because that's probably closest to the experiment we're running. We're going into an area. We sit quiet for 15 minutes. That's our baseline. Take a tree knock. That's certainly, we're cycling out, we're back. A, baseline, sitting quiet. B, being the tree knock. A, going back to baseline, sitting quiet, making recordings. both manual in your notebook as well as audio recordings. AB, you just arrive, make your tree knock, sit 15 minutes to record, and move on to the next spot. With ABA, you've got multiple baselines. Counterbalanced, and so you start with an AB design, slap the tree with a stick, see whether you get a response, move on to the next one. But in the next one, instead of starting with slapping the stick, maybe you use your homemade slapper, your mechanical one that you're tuning to standardize. See what that result brings. You're mixing the order of your variables so that one time it's the tree knocker that you've made, the next time it's picking up a stick, hitting a tree. So you're counterbalancing that order to eliminate the possibility that you're measuring delayed responses to the first stimuli you put out, the first artificial tree knock. And you wait for your response. But then at your next location, starting with the homemade stick, and you get your response. By switching between the two, which you start with, you can tease out again whether it's one or the other or a delayed response to one or the other. And this is the power that experimental design gives us, that what we have been doing doesn't give us. We can control for error and variables, can control our variables. Blind versus double blind versus triple blind tests. I'll tell you this story. It's not a Bigfoot story, but it gives me goosebumps every time I tell it. Not trying to push my spirituality on anyone, but there's a study out there about the effect of prayer on heart disease. Now, in a blind study, in this study, the independent variable was whether the patient was getting prayed for. And the patient was blind to that. They didn't know whether they were getting prayed for, whether they were in the prayer group or the non-prayer group. The physician treating them didn't know which group they were in. And the people doing the prayer didn't know who they were praying for. So they had people sign a piece of paper, put that piece of paper in an envelope, and then randomly assigned those envelopes to a prayer group across the nation. Or they locked, if they weren't in the treatment group, which is prayer, they locked them in a vault, so that the people's names, the people that were represented in those names, they never knew whether they were in the prayer group or the non-prayer group. The people doing the actual prayer, the prayer groups doing the prayer, they never opened up those envelopes. So they didn't know specifically who they were praying for. They just were told they were praying for somebody with a serious medical condition. And that was it. And then this went on for I forget how many months, during which time control variables like blood pressure, medications, the overall blood studies from their heart disease, all these other variables that physicians use to monitor a person's heart disease continued to be monitored without the physician knowing whether the person was in the prayer group or a non-prayer group. So if something got better in one patient, the physician had no idea whether it was because he was in the prayer group, the patient was, or whether that patient wasn't. And they also tried to match patients so that everybody's starting out kind of with approximately the same level of heart disease, okay? Controlling for severity of heart disease. And to make a long story short, basically we got a triple blind study. The patient doesn't know if they're in the treatment, which is prayer, or not. The evaluating physicians don't know if the patient's in it, if that's influencing their heart disease. And the people doing the praying don't know who they're praying for. Well, lo and behold, at the end of this study, what was discovered was that the people who were assigned to the prayer group, their heart disease either remained more stable or improved significantly compared to the people that were in the non-prayer group, keeping all other things an even field, if that makes any sense to you. So it effectively showed the influence of prayer upon heart disease. Of course, then the people that were in the non-prayer group, they were put through a prayer group for themselves because there was an effective treatment of prayer. And whether you think of prayer as cosmic energy, mental energy, emotional energy, spiritual energy, whatever prayer means to you. I'm telling that story because of the blinds. Single blind patient doesn't know it. Double blind physician or experimenter doesn't know it. Triple blind experimenter, or in this case, the people doing the prayer didn't know. Any questions about that? We're going to discuss differential versus inferential statistics. We don't have any normative data. What do we know about tree knocks, really? Not only don't we know how they make them with any certainty, we don't know how often they make them. Of course, there's a theory that it's a form of communication. We don't necessarily know what they mean. That's not to say people don't have their own ideas about what one knock versus two knocks mean, or whatever the case may be. People are out there with ideas, but an idea is knowledge, factual knowledge of something happening is a long leap from an idea. We can hypothesize all we want about what one knock versus two knocks versus three knocks mean, but until we bring some controlled experimental manipulation to it, we're just blindfold shooting at darts because we really don't know. We have no way to control for our own bias and our own hypotheses and error there. So descriptive statistics, it's just describing the nature or the qualities of your sample. So if I do a study, say in Helen, Georgia, everybody knows Helen, Georgia has Bigfoots. If I do a study on Helen, Georgia, that finds that Bigfoots or unknown species make significantly more tree knocks than the human species do, can I say that For all Bigfoots? No, I can't say that's true for all Bigfoots, because all I did was sample a small region of the country's Bigfoot behavior. And until we do similar sampling in the southern region, northeastern region, central region, mountain region, coastal regions, until we selectively sample from all over the United States, all we can really speak to in descriptive statistics is our sample itself. Descriptive statistics tells us about a sample. Tennessee, Kentucky Bigfoot, Helen, Georgia, man, it's a hot spot for Bigfoot. If you ever go visit her, take advantage of it. Inferential statistics, they take that small sample that we've just collected from Helen, Georgia, let's say, and we run another set of different style of statistics that tell us what that means about the overall likelihood of that happening in the population of Bigfoot. Not just our local sample. The inferential statistics gives us numbers that tell us how likely that is representative of Bigfoots throughout the United States, or Bigfoots through all the southern region, depending on how you want to break it down. You've got to have a lot more, a much larger sample to do inferential statistics, and you got to make sure it's representative of the United States than you do for just descriptive statistics. When you're developing any experiment, you've got to do what's called operationalize your variables. Okay. So, well, we're going to do tree knocks. Okay. What kind of material are you going to use? How are you going to, if you're using sticks or bats, how are you going to control for the velocity or force with which that knock is made? Okay. I've already discussed samples. This is our hypothetical Sasquatch tree knock experiment. We want to start locally and then move up to regionally, and then eventually sample throughout the United States. Independent variable. What's the independent variable? The researcher making a tree knock. We want it to be that tree knock sound that is the provocation, which is why we want to control for the force that was made in making the tree knock, which is why we want to control for the sound or the volume or the frequency of the tone that the tree knock produces, because we want it to be the same every time for every area for every Bigfoot. And that's why we standardized our tree knocker. Okay. The dependent variable, again, what's our dependent variable? It's the returned tree knock. Well, let me digress. Independent variable, a tree knock. I glossed over this. But how many tree knocks? You got to use your research team and come to a consensus. Do we just make a single tree knock? Do we make, and immediately wait? Do we make 2 consecutive tree knocks and immediately wait? 3 consecutive and then wait? How many tree knocks for provocation do we use? We don't need to be jumping around from 1 to 2 to 3 unless you want that to be one of your independent variables, and see if there's a difference in response if you knock once versus twice versus 3 times. But each time you add a new independent variable, you add the necessity of having a larger sample. So you got to keep it simple, stupid. Right, Jessica? Um, return. So my point is, there's lots you can do to refine the independent variable. Could you just get a sound blaster? I think there are some recordings of tree knocks. Could we use a sound blaster and blast the sound of those tree knocks and use that as our provocation, so that then we know it's identical in our next spot, we know it's identical up in northeastern United States compared to southeastern United States. It's standardized, it reduces the error in our design. The dependent variable, it's the response in tree knocks. One, do we get a response? How often or how long after our tree knock desisted was it until we got a response back? What kind of response back? A single knock, double knock, triple knock? Did that response seem to come from one source or multiple sources? What was the sound quality of that knock? What was the possible distance of that knock? Okay. And again, we've talked about control variables: rain, snow, surrounding cover, specific location, include your GPS. How close are you to a Bigfoot population versus human population density? Control for chopping wood. Let's see. Speaking of Jessica, yes. Wouldn't the sound be inconsistent due to structures in the area, thickness of the woods? Awesome point. And yes. And so that further underscores why you need to standardize your tree knocking and how you make your tree knock, because the environment itself is going to represent a potential impeding or influencing factor. That's why you want to make a note of, are you in a heavily densely populated with trees forest? Are you standing in a meadow? You want your GPS location in there, and then you want to try and replicate those results in other sites. Awesome question, Jessica. So research a tree knock: native sticks on a native tree, self-made tree knocker versus sound blaster. How many knocks in a provocation? How long between knock trials? I just pulled a 15-minute time frame out of the air. If I were going to do this, I'd make it a single knock and wait 15 minutes, record whether I get a response or not. How many trials do I make in that same location? When I don't get a response in 15 minutes, how many more times do I repeat that tree knock, wait 15 minutes before we get out of that area? And again, then that has to be carried through everywhere else we go, and everyone else who is out there who is doing that. How many times you make a tree knock in one location? Bigfoot versus human tree knock responses. How long after the provocation should we wait till it's considered a knock? If we wait 15 minutes and at 16 minutes, just as we're getting ready to make that next knock, we get a knock, does that count as a response or not? How long after the provocation can the knock come and it still be considered in response to the provocation? How many knocks in response? Same source or different source of location? Estimated distance. Again, this is all coming, you'll notice this is all coming under the heading operationally defining our variables. So here comes the big one, and here comes the beauty, and I think the eloquence of this design. We're going to try and show that the knocks that we're hearing out in the woods are made by Bigfoot or made by an unidentified species and not by humans. How the heck are we going to do that? And this is, again, the beauty of psychological science. How do we control and be able to distinguish between a human tree knock and a Bigfoot tree knock? It comes down to location, 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 location. One of our locations, and this is my attempt at a map, once again showing my primitive and childlike graphic skills. But here's a little map that I've made with a specific location in mind that I've been to, but you won't recognize it. Oh wait, okay. Let me catch up here. It's not a compounding variable, Jessica. It's a confounding variable, something that gets in the way of getting an accurate measure. So I used, maybe before you were here, sometimes beaver tails slapping on the water can sound a lot like a tree knock. So that would be an example of a confounding variable. Sometimes a gunshot can sound like a tree pushover. So we want to consider those confounding variables and control for those or rule them out. Sorry, so many questions, but what about quality of the sound equipment for the tree knocker? Yep. And I went into that a little bit and just was talking about it a little bit as well. Fine tuning your tree knocker, standardizing. If you're going to go with a wood generating sound, you want to make sure every one of your tree knockers produces as close to an identical tone and sustain of that tone as the next tree knock device, so that we know we're getting the same sound each time we make a tree knock in one location, and know that people using that same device in another state are also producing that same identical sound. And that eliminates variability in tone as a factor contributing to whether the Bigfoots respond to it or not. Now that can work against you. What if you're hitting, what if you fine-tuned your Bigfoot tree knocker to one that they don't respond? Uh-oh, what are we going to do now? That's when you run a pilot study. That's why before you do this full experiment we're talking about, you make your tree knocker and you go out and you fine-tune it and whittle away at it and find out using an oscilloscope or some kind of audio recording device to know the frequencies of the tone and the sustain of the tone, and capture which tone works best itself, if that makes sense. So on your left, as you're looking at the screen, the green triangles are the mountains and the trees, yellow campsites around. A good ways away, you got downtown USA, and you got a main road coming from the forest and the camping areas into downtown. So we're trying to capture and differentiate between unidentified species / Bigfoot tree knocks and human tree knocks. So do you think we should put our tree knock station at the camping site? Not necessarily. Why? Because I don't know about you, but some of the campsites that I actually camp and sleep in have Bigfoot phenomena happen, and you can hear tree knocks from some of the locations that you're camping in. And then you're back to square one. You don't know if that's a human tree knock or a Bigfoot tree knock or unidentified species. Oh boy. So you want to go to where a location where you know it can't possibly be a human. You know, I think as close as we may get is Area X. Maybe other people have properties similar to that, where it's so remote and isolated that only another, there's no way a human could be making that without you knowing it. So you move to five locations on that mountain. At each of the five locations, make 5 tree knocks, record whether you get a response or not, and any of the other variables we talk about, so that we know any responses are highly unlikely to be related to Bigfoot, because we're in such an isolated, or can only be Bigfoot, not going to be a human, because we're in such an isolated area. Then we go downtown on the right. Downtown. Who made that song? And we make groups of 5 tree knocks in different locations downtown. Record how many get a response, how many don't. So we've separated out, we're physically, operationally defining and distinguishing between the likelihood that we're going to get a Bigfoot tree knock up there in the mountains compared to where we shouldn't get a Bigfoot tree knock. But if we're going to get a knock, it's probably going to be made by a human downtown. So we're capturing the experience, the phenomena of Bigfoot in one location and the human phenomena in another location. If you've got a big Bigfoot team, coordinate it so that the knocks that are being made in the isolated woods happen at the same identical time as the knocks being made downtown. So you control for timing and weather changes and all that kind of thing. Is this making sense to y'all? Tennessee, Kentucky Bigfoot. No, never mind. I misunderstood what I was reading there. Yeah, thank you, Petula Clark. That shows my age. I can hear her singing that song. So are we clean on this map? Although there's an area, the camping areas where Bigfoot and humans interact, we're trying to get our purest representation or measurement of Bigfoot tree knocks deep back in the woods, and our purest, most isolated human tree knocks. Each knock we record whether we got a knock, and we record whether we didn't get a knock. So we've identified in advance where our knock locations are going to be. Of course, we're continuously recording in those locations as we're doing this audio recording. I've already talked about, do you want to coordinate it so that the knocks in the human area are happening at the same identical time as the knocks in the possible Bigfoot area? You got to develop a recording code sheet and use it in real time. Data, that's your data, those responses. Decide timing points to track. Manually record time between provocations. What other timing kind of issues do you want to keep track of? What's the researcher's response? What do you do when you get a tree knocked back? Do you make just one back? Do you make 2 back? Do you wait time, or do you respond immediately? You've got to figure out these responses all in advance so that when anybody doing this study with you gets a response, you all respond in the same way. And then you do your statistical analysis. We're just going to start with a simple statistical analysis. But this experiment, and I am talking about creating your own experiment. I'm giving you the basic outline for a very simple tree knock experiment here that could be torn to shreds because there's so many variables to control. But you can take, some of these criticisms, some of the fine tuning that we're talking about, and make it your own. I'm just giving you a raw structure. Part of that, honestly, of that raw structure is you need to seriously consider including a third experimental group. Seemingly contradicting myself, you need to include an area where Bigfoot and humans might be interacting and repeat the same procedure there. So now we've got a pure measure of Bigfoot. Downtown, we've got a pure measure of human. And in the camping areas, we've got a measure of humans interacting with Bigfoot. How do you think that's going to help us? Which area do you think will get the most knocks? I haven't done this experiment, but I bet you the camping areas have the most tree knocks because that's where humans are going to be interacting with Bigfoot. So you're going to get likely to get more Bigfoot responses and more human responses. Maybe. That's just my theory. That's my hypothesis. Again, that would conceptually allow us to examine the influence of interactions of human through tree knocks and might prove to be the most responsive, productive response area. Here are our hypothetical test results. Guys, I wish I had put hypothetical up there. These are not real numbers. These are numbers that I just pulled out to give you an example. Okay? So, and we're back to two factors: unidentified species versus human species. Unidentified U species, human species, H species. And this is just to kind of give you a sense of what my recording sheet might look like. What provocation number in the sequence is it? Do you get a hit or miss? And you could you could add lots of stuff to your recording sheet. The time, the delay between provocation and response. You could set up a kind of graphic recording sheet. So we've done 5 locations within your unidentified species area, doing 5 tree knocks at each location. I'm sorry, 525, yeah. Let me, you do, 25. Okay, let me think about the numbers here. You do 25 tree knocks at 4 locations for 100 trials. And you keep track of how many times you got a response, 40, which is a hit, getting a response back to the tree knock, compared to how many times you got no response, 60. So you got a 40-60 split in the Bigfoot species. We look at our numbers from our human tree knocks. You think people downtown are going to make knocks? I don't know. I don't think they're going to make too many. You got 15 responses and 85 non-responses. So, oh boy, 40 responses versus 15 responses. The Bigfoots make more knocks than the humans do. So now we know that the Bigfoots must be making the tree knocks. Well, how do we know that? And that's where the advantage of going back and having an interaction where both Bigfoot and humans make tree knocks in the similar area. So in your camping area, you have the influence of Bigfootness, and you have the influence of humanness interacting with each other. Does that make sense? And then when you get your results, you can use the pure Bigfoot or pure human results to control for the interaction, to regulate and control for the interaction in the camping area. So how do we know, though? Oh boy, I'm out of town. How do we know whether 40 is significantly more than 15? We go to the normal curve. We don't have time to go to the normal curve. I'll pick up with this in the next, because this is kind of the climax, if you will, the normal curve. And our next show will be on the normal curve additionally. Thank you for spending your time with me, listening to me drone on. I really appreciate your attendance. Like, share, subscribe. Know that you guys who are getting out there are in my hearts and in my soul. I wish you a good upcoming week. Keep your mind open. Keep your boots on the ground. And keep your heart with your higher power. God bless you.
I see you running out of reason. Don't try to blame it on the seasons. Why you wanna walk away? When we began, swear we had something that would last. Baby, has the feeling passed? Falling in was easy. How do I make it stay? I'll never let go of you. Tried and true. Oh, I'll never let go of you. Tried and true. Was I a fool? I know sometimes I may wonder, but I would never leave asunder a thing as good as what we have. Is it a rule? What's good is worth the fighting. There ain't no denying that you and I were made to last. Falling in was easy. How can we make it stay? I'll never let go of you. Tried and true. I'll never let go of you. Tried and true. I'll never let go of you. Tried and true. I'll never let go of you. Tried and Have you had a change of heart? Can we go back to the start? I'll never let go of you. Tried and true.
affected by